didn't help that Sam wasn't from this town. It didn't help that Sam was always feeling awkward, always on the outside, one step behind. It certainly did not help that Daddy was put in jail on trumped-up charges with little to no evidence, just coerced eyewitness testimony. It didn't help that he didn't like sports, wasn't yet into girls, and didn't know how to build a boat with his bare hands or whatever else these white kids did on the weekends. It didn't help that he stuttered. He wanted to go back to Chicago. Why, oh why did they have to leave? Why did his mom drag him all the way down here to southern Indiana? Oh, that. Sam rolled his eyes to himself and sighed deeply, the sun beaming down on his ebony skin and his feet burning through the soles of his sneakers as they rested on the metal that covered the roaring bus engine. The oversized assembly of yellow metal and plastic seats wound through the Indiana byways and stopped, on cue, down the street from his Nana's house, his grandmother. "Mom!" Sam bolted through the pink door. "We gotta go!" He threw his backpack against the entryway wall, momentarily glancing up at the portrait of his grandfather, with his two sons, Sam's dad on his left, his uncle on the right, 3 years deceased. How he missed his grandfather. "No one here except little old me." It was his grandma who answered from the living room. Her tone had a bit of a warning in it, mixed with an invitation. He guessed his mom had to work late. Again. "Oh, so sorry, Nana." Sam sunk into the chair nearest her and surveyed the crocheting she was busying herself with. What you making?" He let the question tumble out without the slightest desire to hear the answer. He was sure he had asked the same question 1,000 times before, just to be polite. But in fact, he was reclined with his head on one of her creations at that very moment. With the clear plastic that adorned all her furniture, a lace doily accompanied it, compliments of her tireless handiwork. She skipped his question, they both knew he didn't want the answer to, with a question of her own. "Don't you like it here?" He couldn't expect anything but frankness from the woman with gray hair, almost pure white, cut 2 inches from her scalp in a perfect semicircle, her simple silk scarf wrapped meticulously around her regal head like a crown. He pulled his feet up to his chest to somehow muster the strength for honesty, but she only had to give him that look once that spoke lots of things, but the main idea being if he didn't want his feet crocheted into her next doily, he best get them down off her chair. So he quickly acquiesced, but for further support stared at the ceiling, feet firmly planted on the blue carpeted floor. Right words never came. If they did, his stutter overlapped any coherent meaning. "Miss your friends?" Her dark eyes penetrated through his to his inner soul. He sniffed and repositioned his feet until he could no longer meet her gaze and look back up to the ceiling. "No, never had enough of them. You don't need many. You just need one." Nana Shelton put down her needles for a moment to assess her grandson's demeanor. She grunted a little from the lack of satisfaction, shifted in the floral recliner the whole family had gotten her for Christmas 5 years ago, and continued click-clacking her needles. "Never had that either." Sam mumbled. Only rarely did the words come out right at the times he most wanted not to say them. He wondered if the ceiling might just this once, in stark contrast to its long history of 40 years, suck him up tightly into the sheetrock, so that for the rest of his days he could look down on the world for a change of pace, never to be seen or heard from again. "What's for supper?" "I don't know. You cooking?" Nana's eyes sparkled all over now, pleased with teasing her grandson she adored. "Sure," he answered back with equal velocity. Hot buttered toast, coming right up." She smiled broadly, all her false teeth fighting for escape in a concerted effort. "Black-eyed peas and cornbread, child." Squinting her knowing look, satisfied she won this round. It was late in the evening by this time. Sam turned over on his bed with an uneasy feeling in his stomach. The clock read 12 midnight, displayed in bright red numbers against the black console. Beads of sweat covered his top lip. Another nightmare. He pushed off the extra blanket with his feet. Nana always said too many blankets would give him nightmares. She was right about most things. He lay in silence, dreading tomorrow, for no particular reason, but that it was not his tomorrow. It belonged to whoever was going to throw him against the locker just for fun and take something from him. It belonged to the kids that would scoot further down the cafeteria table when he sat down with his hot meal. It belonged to the lofty eyes that surrounded him on all sides in every single class, looking at him like they didn't know what to do with an intruder. It belonged to the revised history lesson. During the second period, where he didn't know whether to be relieved they glossed over slavery, narrowly escaping uncomfortable stares as if the whole thing was his fault, or angry. The list was endless, the nuances blurred and oppressively dark, but every other person seemed to find great hope in the concept of tomorrow, except him. Not Sam Parker. Not one of his tomorrows had ever been filled with hope. These dreams, though, were reckless, like clarity trying to fight its way out into the sunlight. Just once, let us get out of this side of this stuttering mouth and be free. They quaked inside his mind, enough to blur his vision and shake his soul. So instead he thought about where his dad was at that very moment, locked in a cell, all alone, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mama said he hung around shady characters and reaped the benefits of it. Sam wasn't so sure someone should go to jail for having bad friends, and Nana, well, she was silent about it, which was very out of character. Just then, Sam heard a glass break in the kitchen. Mama's here, he thought. Mama? Sam quietly crept into the kitchen like the sun trying to break through a storm. His mama was not the same since Daddy's arrest. All of her worst fears were realized without the benefit of even one naysayer in her husband's whole indictment process, except him. She wasn't even sure the state council was on his side. No physical evidence to at least put him in the same place as the robbery that left one cashier dead. Just shaky in her mind coerced eyewitness statements, and there he was, locked behind bars, their lives ruined. "What do you want?" came the irritated reply as she slammed the subsequent wine cooler bottle next to the previous one. "You're supposed to be in bed." She sniffed and finally looked up at him, his eyes shocking her with the remembrance of her husband, and it angered her. She scowled at her only offspring. It often isn't anger that can cause us to be so cold with those we love. It's fear. She feared for her son, and she made every effort to escape this terror. Long night binges to prove it. I guess it's innocence that can cause a child to leap feet first into a furnace prepped and ready to consume them. I want to go back to Chicago, Mom. I hate it here." Anger bubbled up like a fizzy drink shaken too much. She was shaken too much, and unfortunately for Sam, he was in the way. He was soaked in the fury of her reaction, and the next thing he knew, he was on the floor with a welt on the side of his face. "Sorry, Mama, I'm sorry." Tears like burning lava down his cheeks, his eyes aching for the reason that could explain why she was so cold. Nana came striding in. She might as well have been on a white horse, and without saying a word, scooped up her grandson the best she could in her frailty and stared evenly at her daughter-in-law. "Mona, we know things are tough, and I love you like my own daughter, but there are some things I will not stand for." It wasn't a time for words or excuses. Like a whirlwind, Sam's mother cleaned up her mess and left the kitchen and scuttled out with a "yes, Mom." Sam's eyes got lost trying to keep up with her in her escape. His sad expression transferred to his grandmother, tears at the brink of another disaster. "Sam, off to bed with you." Anna smiled meekly, but definitely not weakly, and gave her grandson a slight squeeze from the side. "I'll make you some of your favorite French toast for breakfast. Get." Morning came in the same way it always did. Sam blinked open his eyes to the prevailing threats. He found his plate of hot French toast just like his Nana had promised, at his favorite place on the table in the kitchen. His mom watched him eat with mixed expression. She did not utter a word. Nana busied herself with the nondescript, ready to referee should the need arise. She floated above the fray somehow in her usual cheerful self. Sam could remember the last time she ever really had been cross with him, as opposed to the icy aura that was sitting in front of him. Had she bothered to change her clothes? Sam queried in his mind as he examined his mom's same set of scrubs from the night before, in return for her glares in his direction. She didn't appear to care much, twisting in her chair and wrapping her tired hands tighter around her coffee cup. She looked like she might fall over asleep. Finally, he put down his fork, hoping something like a crashing plate on the floor or a house fire would break the excruciating silence. The stare that she had evenly held shifted away to the coffee cup she was holding. "Doing your homework?" she muttered between gulps. Yeah, Mama." Sam responded with a flood of relief, but kept himself from saying more, looking hard for any sign of endearment. "We are going to see your dad this weekend." The statement was blurted out immovably. But, Mama!" Sam attempted a protest. This time the anger that returned was subdued to a lower decibel, but it was as unmistakable as the night before. "We are going." The order rounded off with a slam to the table, applied by her clenched fist. She lifted herself with great force from the table disgustedly and slid the chair back into its position with a screech and a jolt, leaving immediately. Sam sat defeated on the threshold of tears again. His Nana turned toward him from her position near the sink and sighed. Sam could sense a hint of disapproval over his protest, but the last place he wanted to go was to that cold, lifeless concrete prison. Prison where 1,000 souls met their earthbound purgatory, where it wasn't so much about the crimes you committed, but the societal positions you found yourself in prior, almost as if numbers were called up randomly, and 1 out of 4 black men were eventually going to face their time, still paying for the crimes of being black. His dad didn't deserve to be there. He didn't commit the crime. He knew somebody who identified him in a lineup, and that was it. Life behind bars. I don't want to go, Nana. He looked down at the puddle of maple syrup in his white Corningware plate, wishing he could slide into it. Sure. Nana folded her arms into lockdown position. I do remember you saying that, but my question to you is, what should you do? Go with Mama, I guess. Sam shifted in his seat and momentarily pleaded with his eyes to soften his grandmother's resolve. Visit those imprisoned, she said softly, turning to finish the dishes. That was it, then. It's all right, Mona. I'll get out of here. Sam's dad leaned over the table to grab his wife's hand, but she swiftly pulled it away. The tears had not ceased to run down his wife's weary face from the moment she saw him. Baby, I promise. He lowered his head into the palms of his hands and sighed with the weight of the world, almost visibly causing stress to the table. Somehow, please believe me, was the final muffled plea. Far worse than being locked up in prison was the idea that his wife might leave him. Every Saturday they met would remind him of what kind of thin line his marriage was on. Sam folded his arms and focused on his feet as he sat uneasily in the plastic orange chair next to his mom. His face was warm with frustration, and his own tears threatened to surface. Not today, he told himself, and contained them as best he could. Visitation rooms were the worst. The guards seemed unimpressed with the awkward reunion that involved no hugging or walking outside or a game of catch. They just stared in each other's direction at conference-style tables until the time was up, with weather talk escalating to gross injustice that had swallowed their family whole. The guard folded his arms stiffly without any hint of softening, keeping a watch on the clock as if there was something for Sam's dad to get back to doing. Sam sighed to mimic his dad. He wanted this nightmare to end and hear that this had all been a big mistake. 12-year-olds were supposed to hope for the impossible, before the world inevitably crowded out the wonder, but this hope was dying. It died in the tears of his mother. It died in the hardened eyes of the guard. It died as he witnessed the weight of his father carried. It died as weekend after weekend they did the same thing and said the same things at the same time on Saturday with no end in sight. The hope that his dad was coming home was a bleak line of light in a landscape where the sun had long past set. Would their shattered lives ever mend? All he felt was uncomfortable sitting there in this orange plastic seat, the kind of uncomfortable that leaves a permanent knot in your stomach, the kind of uncomfortable that has no words to describe it. Time to go, Tony. The guard's announcement invaded the solemnity. His name was Kriston, but he ended up with the nickname in high school. Sam's family attributed it to his love for pizza. Every chance Sam's dad got, he was at Uno's on Ohio Street as a kid. The family never had much money to spare, but Grandpa had a good job working as a history teacher in Bronzeville. He served in World War II before that, and then he and Nana raised their kids in a relatively prosperous life, though redlined in the south side of Chicago. And all the conversations the family had at Thanksgiving or Christmas, these were the best times. Sam would learn about and fall in love with Chicago, hearing the stories of his family, their friends, and the black community of Bronzeville when it thrived. Papa retired when he and Nana could no longer take the conditions they were forced to deal with. They saw discouragement and aimlessness take over in the South Side, and Papa's teacher's heart broke when he saw the paths his students chose. They left Chicago before Sam was born, but Sam's dad stayed, believing things would get better. So much for that. We gotta go. Mona stood up swiftly and grabbed Sam's arm in the shuffle. Will I see you soon? Kriston's eyes pleaded with her louder than his words. Mona looked blankly in his direction, in a way which startled both Sam's dad and Sam. Without saying a word, she and Sam left. The hours home were excruciating. Sam could not ever remember them being so much so. Not a word was said, all the way from Thompson to where they lived outside Lafayette. After Sam's dad was railroaded and put in jail, they moved in with Nana because Sam's mom was unable to make ends meet financially, as well as raise Sam. The drive for Sam, he had to admit, was almost as bad as the meeting with his dad. Sam wondered if the only reason she stayed married was for the semblance of stability it offered. She didn't seem to love him anymore. Maybe she was just scared. He also wondered if the only reason they lived with Nana was because it was convenient. She didn't seem attached to anyone, not Sam, not Nana either. Mona Park had not been herself at all for 2 years now. Carrying the weight Sam's dad had carried, plus her own fears, late nights working at the nursing home, keeping these appointments at the prison on Saturdays when she wasn't working, was taking a toll on her. All to raise a 12-year-old boy to adulthood. Maybe she resented Sam. Everything seemed encompassed about with the fear that Sam's fate would be the same as his dad's. But what exactly would make his prospects for a better life different? If the terror that had wreaked havoc on their lives was just as indiscriminate toward the black innocent ones now, what would change when Sam grew up? Sam blinked his eyes open after falling asleep in the back of the large blue Oldsmobile. All the angst had momentarily faded into a pleasant dream, until being rudely awakened by what appeared to be flashing lights from behind his eyelids. The only words Mona had said the whole trip was just then, "What is this?" Except this wasn't passivity or annoyance. This was great alarm. What's wrong? Sam's eyes were fully open now to the reality that there was an ambulance and a police car in front of their tiny pink house. Various neighbors stood around outside in a frantic shuffle, some with house dresses on and some still wearing their work clothes. Kelly, the next-door neighbor's daughter, was wearing her pajamas. She was Sam's age. All were gathered in a semicircle like an ill-planned and frazzled welcoming committee. Mona slammed the driver's side car door shut in exclamation to the scene that lay before her. "Oh, Mona!" cried Hilda. Nana's best friend from a few doors down ran to Mona's side, her little terrier in tow. "Stell's had a heart attack." Sam was quietly coming up behind the conversation when Mona grabbed him, apparently to cling to something, or not let whatever had transpired here take Sam too. When she finally responded, she did so hesitantly. Is she okay?" "Oh, sweetie," Hilda rubbed Mona's arm in as warm a gesture as she thought Mona would accept. "I just don't know. I'm the one who called the ambulance. You?" Mona held Sam in a near chokehold at this point, her eyes fixed on the front door, now barely cognizant of the little white-haired lady rambling incessantly. "Yes, Stella called me, said she wasn't feeling well," and Hilda melted with a shudder into position to pick up her small dog who had decided barking at the ambulance crew was a noble cause. She continued her story as the EMTs emerged from the house with Sam's Nana on a stretcher. Sam could no longer take standing still, stagnant in his mom's death grip. He broke free, details of how this came about, left in a whirl to run straight to her. "Nana!" The tears overflowed from his stopped position right next to her on the stretcher. His vision blurred so that he could only see the white cloth on the stretcher, and grabbed it with foolish determination. Nana looked at him and closed her eyes again, but he had not perceived it. "Get that kid out of here!" came a thunderous response, but not at close proximity to the herd of medics that surrounded Stella Parker. Sam wasn't sure of the source, but felt that it was a police officer. "He can come with us." Someone grabbed his arm in a quieter, gentler manner. "Come on, son, if it's okay with your mom." But what about the officer? All faces were still a blur, and everything was moving so quickly, Sam's chest heaving in its rhythm. He wasn't sure who made the remark about disobeying the angry-sounding officer, but thought it was a younger EMT who echoed his fearful thoughts. "Oh, Mike will get over it." Sam looked up to see another officer who startled him as he emerged from the house after everyone else. He smiled slightly in Sam's direction and sobered up to focus on the task at hand. Sam let out a sigh and blinked away his tears, rubbing his face to make sure by the officer's expression that he meant what he said. Sam glanced over at his mom, who was still standing in the herd, hoping that she would understand where he was going without having to yell anything over the chaos or say too much around the police. He knew how a lot of black boys fared in situations concerning the police. He had been taught from very young how to stay out of trouble. "I'll find you there, Sam." Mona shook her head and covered her face with her hands. This was a day Sam would never forget, not because it was necessarily the worst with the passing of his grandmother, but because it was absolutely the farthest thing from his mind as a possibility. Catastrophic. No more quiet afternoons eating popcorn while she drank her 10th cup of coffee. No more listening to the clicking of her needles as the day's troubles slowly erased from his mind, even if for a short while. No more quotations from the Bible slipping out of her mouth like scripture was her native tongue. No more smells wafting from the kitchen around supper time that somehow thrilled his soul more than his favorite TV programs or a trip to an amusement park. No more. Suddenly. The short drive to the hospital in the ambulance was the only time he had to prepare himself for the rest of his life with this large vacancy. Anna made no movements, just shallow breaths as he pleaded with her to open her eyes and look at him one more time, but she didn't. He only saw what looked like peace come over her, and one time he thought he felt her squeeze his hand. "I'm sorry, son. It'll be all right, kid. These things happen, so sorry." None of those phrases from the medical crew helped him endure this shock to his heart. They carted his Nana away and made a semblance of effort to revive her, but it seemed like the people in blue scrubs with stethoscopes hanging around their necks were just going through the motions for his sake. They periodically made sideways glances at him and whispered under their breath. The younger EMT, with sad expression, made his way over to where Sam stood in a puddle of his worst fears and offered to guide him to the waiting room, where he was sure to find his mom. Sam reluctantly followed with an overwhelming feeling of fracture, like he should lay right down on one of the gurneys and wait to be plastered together. "Sam!" He recognized his mom's voice, but could not identify her yet. There was a large crowd that stood in the waiting room with her. Stella Parker had influenced a lot of people, and a lot of people loved her. He stood still. He waited for his mom to come hold him so that he could bury his head in her chest and cry as to give voice to his bleeding soul. But she just approached him quickly, grabbed his arm, and sat him down next to her in a heap of her own worst fears coming to light. She had a look of confusion, horror, and Sam had the sense that she was utterly uncomfortable with all the people around. He stared blankly ahead, silent through all the condolences and well-wishing. Some touched the top of his head and prayed, but he felt nothing. Not a word could be said, no soothing oil, no prayer. His heart was as dark as the night that had heavily enclosed them in. Not a word was uttered when the solemn doctor came out to make official what everyone already expected. Not a word was spoken between Sam and his mom the entire week that followed. She went back to work, and Sam returned to school the following Tuesday. Every day he came home to an empty, stale-smelling house and stared at an empty, flowered chair, knitting needles still stuffed into her last project, in a basket on the floor right beside it. Sam wanted so much for the glass ceiling to break, and the eerie sense that something more ominous was coming would shatter and reveal just an overactive imagination. He could not shake it, but in his world the worst things came true. In his world there was no alternative option. In his world there was no escaping the dregs. After his mom told his dad over the phone that Nana had passed away, he listened at a distance from the receiver as his father cried for a full hour, and he watched his mom stare at the floor with barely a glistening in her eyes. How he hated his mom for that just then, like she had never been cruel before, never lost her temper before, had never hit him before. He was so angry with her, not for anything in the past, but for what he was witnessing while she was on the phone with his broken-hearted dad. Getting stared at school took on a whole new meaning. Before, he was convinced that most of the kids were not kind, even prejudiced, except for maybe one or two that were outsiders like himself. But now he was convinced that every child at his junior high school walked around him without hearts in their chests, no concept or care as to what had taken place. Only occasionally would he see a neighbor with a sad expression and a weak smile. He wanted so much to tell someone all what he was feeling and thinking, but the words, again, were locked inside his mouth. "I'm sending you to live with your Uncle Emery for a while." Sam had to look up from his instant mashed potatoes that were thrown together onto his plate, with a side of hot dogs and canned green beans, to actually believe what he had just heard from the other side of the table. It was a mild, late spring Saturday evening, after living through the hardest week of his life. His grandmother had been buried the night before, and all of her friends brought condolences, gifts, flowers, and letters of encouragement that morning. He wept again for all that lay buried in the ground. Surely, he thought, things could possibly start looking up, only now for them to suddenly make an instant slide further down, per usual. His uncle, the great uncle on his mother's side that looked after foster kids. But Sam could not believe what he was hearing. Mona centered her gaze on her son, but anger was not written all over it, just deep distress and sadness. It It will only be for the summer, until I work something out. She deflectingly shoveled a dollop of white clouds into her mouth, but chewed it in an uncomfortable fashion. You can't stay here all summer by yourself, Sam. She pursed her lips, swallowing the gluey texture hard. Sam's head was suddenly in a swirl of anger and panic. He only knew his Uncle Emery by name. He could see nothing positive about moving to Virginia at all. To move in with a bunch of orphans, to fall under the care of a virtual stranger, this could not be happening. No! Sam could not contain himself. He pushed himself back from the table, knocking over the chair. I won't go! Sam! His mom's voice followed him as he ran out the back sliding glass door, straight for an unknown destination, his feet carrying him further and further with the consuming momentum of frustration and anger. The forest behind their neighborhood looked good enough to hide in, and right in the middle of it, he landed in a heap.